I'm the only one here?
All right. Ask for the food in here.
What it
Cool.
yeah, it's so weird. It hates me, Daddy. Hmm.
Mhm.
All right, hey there, everyone. I say as of the moment, we only have one person here live, and that's okay. As you probably
Yeah.
all. Oh, hi. Sorry. Go ahead. What were you saying?
Nothing. I was just gonna giggle because I'm the only one here.
So, hi, how do you?
Hi.
Yeah, so at least for right now, this will kind of be more like a tutoring session, I guess. So the I'm not surprised by that. Usually with first year ends, usually there's more live appearance because people are a little more nervous and all that. With second year ends, people, they kind of know what to expect and everything. Generally, they've done it before. So they register to get the materials and they watch the recordings, but they don't necessarily have as many pressing questions. So they just watch the recordings on their own time. And that's fine. People are welcome to attend live. Definitely, if you've got questions and stuff, it's better to attend live because, it could have more back and forth. But of course, you could always email me if you have a question as well, like if you can't attend live. And there's no required attendance. So people are welcome to just watch the recordings or whatever works for you. So basically, this, of course, is a review to prepare you for taking these second year comps. And similar to the first year comps, like what we'll do is the first day here, I'll give you a lot of handouts and we'll go over a lot of things in an overview fashion the first day. So, like after this first day, you should have a pretty good idea of generally speaking what the second year comps covers and therefore what you need to start preparing for. And there'll be a lot of handouts that are self-contained that I'll essentially give you and say, here's some things you have to start looking at, but they're self-contained. Mostly there's stuff that you already studied for first year comps and already passed. And then the stuff that's uniquely second year material, that'll be some of the stuff that in the future weeks we'll go over in a little more detail and narrow it down for you. So today might feel a little overwhelming because it's a lot of remember to look at this, remember to look at that. And most of it again is self-contained and you already passed this material on your first year comps, but I just go over it. So just to kind of give you a quick reminder, and also like if people were here live or even if you're watching the recording, if you have any questions about that material, this just sort of to bring it up quickly so you could ask about it. But of course, a lot of this does have to be sort of directed study because keep in mind we only have 5 class meetings to go over 2 years worth of content. So a lot of this does have to be just pointing you in the right direction. We obviously don't have time to literally reteach everything in 5 class meetings. Oh, we have a second person here. So, okay, good. So let's just start real quick. Syllabus doesn't really matter much, but I'm just required to give people a syllabus for any course. But the syllabus really isn't critical. The only thing the syllabus is going to tell you, and this is really in the Moodle shell anyways, is that the class meets on Thursdays from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Pacific time. So if there's anybody watching the recording now, but maybe wants to attend live next time, make sure you do note the time on the syllabus is in Pacific time. And we don't meet every week. So this lists the weeks we meet weeks 1, 2, 4, 7, and 9. And the actual dates are listed down here in the schedule in the outline. And of course, you have my email. And of course, you could just contact me directly through the Moodle shell as well. So, I mean, that's not really critical, but you have my email in case you need to contact me for any reason. And a lot of you I probably know at this point, but it is possible that there's people that, don't have to take some of my classes because they already have a background in the biosciences or something. So for anybody I don't know, my name is Matt Salingo, and I am a instructor on the San Diego campus, but all my classes are online. So I have students from all campuses and all of my classes. And I am an acupuncturist myself. I've been through the program and everything, so know all the TCM stuff. But all of my classes, like other than this class, are in the bio department. So I teach a lot of the bioscience classes. And so therefore, teaching this review class kind of makes sense because it's very difficult to find somebody sometimes that knows both. You either have a lot of people that are really good with the TCM stuff and they teach points classes, but like they're kind of weak, they feel kind of weak and lack confidence with the bio stuff, or vice versa. We might have like a naturopath or something that teaches some bio courses, but they don't really know the TCM. So that's kind of how I ended up with this course because I do teach bioscience classes, even though I am a acupuncturist myself. So that's kind of how that all came to be. All right. So anyway, you don't really need the syllabus much other than just for, you see the weeks that we meet, the dates. So just make sure you put the dates and everything in your calendar if you do want to attend live. because every once in a while there's those students, I'll get an email like, hey, I'm here in class, nobody's here, what's going on? And it's like, well, because we don't meet today. So make sure you take a look at this. And this will list kind of the general topics that we plan to get to each week. We're not always 100% on schedule because of course when you're reviewing 2 years worth of content over the course of 5 classes, it's like we do our best to get to as much as possible without just sort of speed reading through everything. So, we'll do our best and it depends on questions and things like that, but this is an outline of generally what we expect to get to each week. Right. Now let me just show everybody real quick where to find things in the Moodle shell, because that'll be important, but it's a very straightforward Moodle shell. There's no exams. This is all just about, helping you prepare for the second year comp exam. There's no requirements for this class itself. I mean, you could attend or not attend. You could look at the materials thoroughly or you could not. You could study little by little, which I recommend, or you could wait till the last minute. It's entirely up to you. This is just giving you the resources that would be helpful to get you, to more likely, more confidently pass the exam. So there's no requirements. I mean, there's no tests or anything like that that you need to turn in, nothing like that. I'm just going to keep that and get rid of that there. So the only thing you really need here is the Zoom link. And then you can see if you want the syllabus for some reason, there it is. Syllabus part 2 is just college policies. You don't really need that. The class handouts is really the main thing that you need. So the class handouts, if you click on this is where you get all the handouts that I'm going to be referencing. And you can see they're divided into the 5 class meetings. You have to click on this little triangle here in order to expand it. Like if you're just going around here, it's like, where is everything? But if you click on that little triangle, then it expands everything and then you can find all the handouts. So you can see the first day, there's a ton of handouts because there's a lot of stuff I'm just giving you up front. When you get to the subsequent classes, you can see there's far fewer. So much fewer for the subsequent classes. Right. But that's basically where you get everything that you're going to need week to week. This is where you get all the handouts. You just print them, download them, whatever from there. So everything I'm going to be referencing in class is in those folders in the class handout area. Then this is just the exact same review video that I gave you for the first year comps where I kind of went over some of the practice tests and stuff. So just in case anybody wants to reference that video again, it's here, but it's the same exact thing as you had for the first year comps. And that's really all you need in the Moodle shell. Okay. The only thing I just want to say quickly, just something to be a little bit careful of. It's not a huge deal, but just something to try to be a little bit careful of. What for some reason, and I've never gotten a good reason why anybody ever does this. Like I don't really get it. But sometimes what will happen is people will go to the upcoming meetings outside of class time. So it'll be just, whatever, random Sunday night or something. And somebody will click on start upcoming meeting. And then they go into an empty Zoom room and they're there for a minute or so and then they log out. Well, every time somebody does that, it creates a cloud recording. And then all those cloud recordings get mixed in with the real cloud recordings, the real recordings of the class. And there winds up being, 50 recordings that are like a minute long, 30 seconds long. And I can delete them, but it's not like I'm in here 24/7 deleting them as they come up. It's something that periodically I check. In the meantime, there's a bunch of recordings and people can't find what they're looking for. So just try to be careful not to do that. There's no reason to ever click start upcoming meeting other than to attend class. If you're not coming to attend class during class time, then there's no reason to ever click start upcoming meeting. All it does is take you to an empty Zoom room. So just try to be careful about that. I don't know. Does anybody have an explanation? It's one of those things kind of bugs me a little bit. Like I don't know why anybody goes into an empty Zoom room outside of class time. It never makes any sense to me, but it happens every term. I don't know. You don't really have to answer it, but I'm just so like one of those things like I've always wondered about, like, why are people going into an empty Zoom room? What is the point? Anywho. All right. So that's basically where you find things. That's all you have to find. So that part should be pretty straightforward. Then this here, this is in your class handouts. Again, everything that I'm showing you is in your class handouts, so you can get copies of these for yourself. This here is the second year comprehensive exam information packet that the college puts out. This is not one of my handouts. The college puts this out. You can find it in the student hub. You might even be able to find physical copies in your student lounge. I'm not sure if they print out physical copies anymore, but at the very least, it's in the student hub. And this will give you some information about the exam kind of from the administration, from the college as a whole. This is sort of the law of the exam. So like what it says here is sort of etched in stone. That's sort of like the exam law, what they're telling you to expect and whatnot. Anything that you hear just generally from other people, that's not necessarily reliable. The college isn't bound by that. So, always be a little bit discerning or questioning, like, your friend told you this, or one of your clinic supervisors mentioned that, because things change. Like a clinic supervisor, an instructor that isn't necessarily like intimately familiar with the comps might be telling you something that they remember from back when they took the comps 5 years ago or something, and it may not apply anymore. So just always to be sure, make sure you're looking at something like this if you have a question about the rule. To the question in the chat box, it's in the same area as like all the handouts that I was just showing you. It should be in the class one, and it should say something like comp exam information packet or something. It's just one of the many handouts in there. So I mean, if you download all your handouts from the class one in the Moodle shell, this is one of the handouts that should be in there. Now, most of this is just fluff. You don't necessarily need every detail on here. A lot of it's just fluff, like, introduction, encouragement from the board of trustees, stuff like that. But there is some helpful info in here. Like, for example, you scroll down and it'll tell you things like, here we go, the different sections of the exam, how many questions for that section, the time limit, those kinds of things. So it tells you that there's an acupuncture section that you get an hour and 5 minutes to answer 60 questions. There's a Chinese medicine theory section. You get an hour and 5 minutes to answer 60 questions. There's a bioscience section, an hour and 5 minutes to answer 60 questions. Law and safety, 15 minutes, it's only 10 questions. And then there's a case study section that's a little bit longer, hour 40 minutes, 70 minutes to answer it. Or sorry, 70 questions, hour 40 minutes, 70 questions. And herbs, remembered, most of you are not taking herbs. Most of you will be taking herbs next term if you're following the model curriculum. So herbs, you'll generally speaking take separately. But if you are taking herbs, an hour and 35 minutes for 75 questions. So this handout does give you some information about things like that that might be helpful just to kind of know what to expect. Will in this review class be going into the details of what's on the acupuncture section, what's on the Chinese medicine theory section, but these are all the sections, number of questions, number of minutes, etc., for you to prepare for. And remember that just like first year, each of these sections is graded independently, and you have to get a 70% on each section in order to pass. If you get below a 70% on any one of those sections, then you would have to retake that section the following term. But whatever you do pass is in the bank. So if you do pass the other sections, that's done, that's in the bank. But if you were to not pass a section, then the following term, you'd have to retake just that section alone. And you could see again, if you continue to scroll down, it gives you a little bit of a breakdown of some of the questions. And again, I'll be going in the review class of like what topics to focus on, but this just gives you a little bit of an outline, a little bit of an overview. So you could see like there's five element questions, and there's 15 questions on diagnosis, like what pattern does the person have, stuff like that. Acupuncture channels, you can see there's 15 questions on location and functions. There's 15 questions on pathways, pathology, 5 questions on like body measurements, which are like Soon measurements and such. So it gives you an idea of generally what to expect. And then again, a lot of fluff that you don't have to really read through. But then if you scroll all the way down, it'll tell you about the practical as well. So there's a practical where you have to do point location. That's exactly the same as first year comps. Literally the exact same procedure. You go in a room, there's a model, you're given a piece of paper that looks something like this, except instead of saying point one, point two, it'll list actual acupuncture points. And you flip it over, you'll have a pencil to check mark, put check marks, cross things out, write notes, and you'll be given 10 stickers and you have 10 minutes to locate 10 points. That's exactly the same procedure, exactly the same mechanism as first year. You basically just have to do that one more time. And then if you scroll further down, and again, I'm just going through this as an overview. You could look through this yourself if you want to look through it more thoroughly, but I just want to give you an idea of the kind of things that are in here. I'm scrolling through all the herbs because there's a separate review class for herbs. So scroll through the herbs. See, it's long. This will tell you, like, for example, from O&E2, which O&E test you're responsible for. You could see you're not necessarily responsible for every single O&E test. So these are the ones from O&E2 that you're responsible for. You don't have to perform them. You don't have to do them. There's no O&E practical, but for the written exam, these are the ones that you have to know. Now, my handouts will reflect that. Like basically, these are the tests we'll review in the review class. So my handouts will reflect that, but you can see here the reason I cover certain O&E tests and not others is because this tells us which O&E tests are fair game for the exam. And then this is the checklist or the script essentially for the other part of the practical, which is clean needle technique. So you have to do the clean needle technique, which is the whole, set up your instruments and equipment, set up a clean field, put out your needles, wash your hands, all that kind of stuff. And so you'll have to do that just like you did for first year. Exactly the same procedure, exactly the same script as first year, but you just again have to do that one more time. You do not need to do the moxa, the cupping, the gua sha, just clean needle technique for second year. And again, like I'll go over this stuff as we go within the review class, but if you ever come to a point where like you're forgetting something, you don't want to have to rewatch the recordings, you don't want, of course, you could always ask me, but you could always refer to this. Like if you're like, wait a minute, somebody told me I have to do moxa. If you go through here, if you look at this, the information packet for second year, you'll clearly see there's nothing about doing moxa. It's just the clean needle technique. So again, you ever have any questions about that? You're having a last minute panic, somebody told you something, you could always look to this guide as what's true. So yeah, as far as the practical goes, the only thing that you have to do for the practical is the point location, 10 points in 10 minutes, and the clean needle technique. So basically, you'll get an appointment time for your practical that you'll show up for, just like with first year, but you'll probably only be there for like 15 minutes or so. 10 minutes for your point location, and then clean needle tech just takes a few minutes. That's pretty fast. As long as you know what you're doing and you're going confidently, that's just a few minutes. So it's usually a pretty short day for the practical. All right. So again, for now, just kind of know this is here, something that you could look at. You don't have to read it all thoroughly. Like there's a lot of fluff in there, but just know it includes some information like this that could be helpful, could be informative to you. Any questions on any of that so far before we kind of start diving into the individual sections and really diving into reviewing? All right. One other thing I just want to point out, just like with first year comps, I did include practice tests in your class handouts. So you can see here, second year end practices. I also included the first year end practice tests because all that stuff on first year is basically still fair game for second year. The only topic that I know for a fact doesn't come up on second years, they don't ask about like biology or biochemistry. Other than the biology, biochemistry questions from first year, other than that, anything from first year is fair game on second. So I included the first year practice quizzes in your handouts. And there's also some additional ones that are uniquely second year that have a mix of stuff. So it's just like the ones I gave you for first year, it's just more questions. So there's some OM theory questions, some herbs mixed in. You could ignore those if you're not doing herbs this term. Acupuncture, so you can see here's an auricular question, another auricular question. So things like that. Bio and law and safety. And that's something to just kind of take a look at on your own, see how you do. Like, I mean, you could do it up front. Like, you could try doing them now, try doing them this week, and just kind of see what you remember. Or you can wait until you've had a little more time to study and then try it as you get closer to the exam. But the practice tests are kind of meant to just give you an idea of what kind of areas you need to focus on. They're not the end all be all. Like, don't just study the practice quizzes. Like, these are not like a hint, hint, I'm really giving you the exam. These are just representative questions that include the types of questions that the comp goes into. So if you're missing questions in certain areas, it's representative of like you need to look at that topic, not just memorize that one answer. So for example, if you don't know that cancer of glandular tissue is referred to as an adenocarcinoma, it doesn't mean just memorize that. It means go to the review handouts and make sure that you're looking at that general topic of cancers and tumors. That means, it's representative of the fact that you need to know that topic a little better. And the answer, there is a separate answer key. So separately in the class handouts, you'll find an answer key for the practice tests. I have the answers separate so that way they're not right in front of you. You're actually taking, and you can print out as many versions as many times as you want. So you can keep printing out blank tests or make copies of it and then like actually take it like a test and then check your work with the answer key. So again, just a reminder, those are there, just something to practice on your own. And like with anything, even the stuff that I'm giving you up front to look at on your own, you can certainly ask me if questions come up, whether it be email or setting up a meeting or coming to class and asking. All right. So any questions about that or anything so far? All right. Well, let's go in now to the individual topics then. And I'm going to present some handouts. Like I said, a lot of these handouts are self-contained. They're mostly things that like look at on your own. You already did this for first year ends. Basically, just do it again. I'm going to kind of run through them briefly in case anybody has any questions and just sort of to kind of run through and give you a quick reminder of, hey, here are the kinds of topics that come up. But mostly these are going to be self-contained handouts to look at on your own. So the first section we'll start with is the Chinese medicine theory section. It already said that there's 60 questions on the comps for this section, the Chinese medicine theory. We already said 60 questions. That was in the review packet. And the good news about this is exactly the same content, the same material you're being tested on. Not necessarily the same questions, but the same material you're being tested on as first year comps. This basically covers fundamentals 1 through 4. You're just having to do it one more time. You're just having to do it again because you have to keep reinforcing this material because ultimately you need to know it all for boards and everything. And of course, ultimately you need to know it to work with patients. You need to know like tongues, pulses, patterns, etc. So this is nothing new. The entire Chinese medicine theory section is the same universe of material as you studied for first year comps. And you're all here because you passed first year comps. So essentially, it's just study it again, pass it again. So I'll do a quick run through of the materials, but this should be all the same stuff that you already got for first year comps. In other words, once we kind of go through this overview, you've got what you need to study for second year Chinese medicine theory. we don't really need to address too much within the class because it's all the same stuff that you've already passed, just doing it again. That said, you could ask questions if they come up, of course. So there's this handout that's labeled various OM topics. And this includes things like yin versus yang and types of qi and stuff like that. This is all the stuff that you would have probably learned in Fundamentals 1. This stuff still comes up. So you may recall from first year comps, yin versus yang. You got to know like what makes something more yang in nature versus more yin. Like yang, we tend to think of as warmth, activity, movement, energy, that kind of stuff. Upper body, exterior. Where yin, it's all the opposite: stillness and darkness and coolness and the inferior part of the body and more substance as opposed to energy, so like fluids and things like that are more yin in nature, where like something like qi is more energetic, more yang in nature. You want to know that generally speaking, these kinds of things are more yin relative to these kinds of things that are more yang. And just like first year comps, you will get some questions where it'll ask you like, which of the following is the most yang, let's say. And three of the options will say things that are more yin in nature, like darkness, nighttime, coolness, something like that. And then one of the options will say something like activity. And you need to be able to recognize that of those four things, activity would be the most yang relative to the other things. So you tend to get a few questions like that. Again, should be familiar from first year comps. Nothing new, nothing different. Just one more time. Then you want to know as much as you can the yin yang relationships and like sort of an example of each. How do yin and yang relate with each other, interact with each other? Again, this is stuff that's come up before. You just want to kind of recognize these terms. They can oppose one another. Like fire is yang, water is yin. So they can oppose each other, create balance. Fire can warm water and cause water to evaporate, but water can put out a fire. So there's opposition. They create balance. Deficiency of one can lead to excess of another. For example, if somebody is yang deficient, and their spleen, for example, is not processing the food and the water that they're consuming, well, then that stuff accumulates. It's not being processed properly and it accumulates, and it could lead to what we call dampness. And dampness could be a form of excess yin. So again, there's an opposition to these things. But they also depend on each other, interdependence. You need yin organs, like physical, substantive organs, in order to carry out the yang energy, the yang commands. So, you almost think of it as like yin is kind of like the anatomy, the structure, the substance. And yang is more like the energy, the qi, the nervous system, the function, that kind of stuff. So you need the physical structure in order to carry out the function. But you also need the function to maintain the structure. They work together. You need circulation to maintain your tissues. But without the tissues, there's no point in having circulation, because there's nothing to nourish. So again, they work together. There's an interdependence. Mutual consuming, excess heat. Like if somebody has a high fever, that can cause a lot of excess sweating. And then they become dehydrated. They can develop dryness, become dehydrated. So the idea is like that excess heat, which is yang energy, can consume and deplete the yin fluids. Intertransformation, like things are not uniquely one or the other. There's always a spectrum. There's always a constant, transformation. So like the simplest example is daytime turns into nighttime. Nighttime turns into daytime. And like at what points, like there's not usually a clear point. Like at what point are we in yang time? At what point are we in yin time? It's a constant transformation. It's a constant evolution and back and forth. So there's intertransformation. One thing evolves into the next. And then lastly, of course, there's what we call interdivisibility. Anything could be further broken down. And that changes kind of the yin yang makeup. So like if you talk about the earth relative to the sun, well, the sun is obviously more yang and the earth is more yin in that comparison. But then if you go into the earth and you break it down to, well, you have oceans and you have land. Well, then it's like, well, oceans are more yin relative to the land. But then it's like on the land, there's deserts and then there's tundras. And it's like, well, the deserts are dry and hot. The tundras are cold and covered in snow. So it's like, the deserts are more young relative to the tundras, and so on. So the idea is there's infinite divisibility. Everything's relative. Very, very few things, if any, are sort of just absolutely yin or yang because you could always further break it down. So these are just some of the yin yang concepts to keep in mind that you might get a couple questions asking about what are the relationships of yin and yang and maybe an example of them. So if you know what's here, you should be pretty good. Vital substances, three treasures, that's something to just kind of commit to memory. Those are straightforward things. You might just get asked, like, which of the following is one of the three treasures, which of the following is a vital substance, and so on. And it's one of those things where you just either know it or you don't. So there's really nothing to think about. And that's one thing to keep in mind. One thing that I've noticed with people on the comps, particularly somebody that doesn't pass and they're reaching out to me for advice or whatnot, I notice sometimes when I'm going over things with them that they missed. Every question, they're giving me this rationale that, well, I was thinking this or that. And they're way overthinking or kind of trying to apply critical thinking or rational reasoning to something that just has a defined answer. Like the three treasures are just defined in the TCM literature, Shen, Shi, and Jing. That's it, period. There's nothing to think about. Those are the three treasures according to the TCM um, resources. So that it just is what it is. So if you're trying to think, well, I don't know, I thought blood was really important. Blood is, pretty vital to the body. So I thought that should be one of the three treasures. Again, you're overthinking it. So there's certain things you just have to study and commit to memory because they're just defined. They are what they are. There's no critical thinking involved. You can certainly come up with reasons to make sense of something, but there's certain things where you just have to apply the answer that is the answer that you know. That's a good example. Yeah, it's just like first year comps. It's all multiple choice. Other than the practical. Then types of chi. You got to know things like gu chi versus zong chi versus wei chi. So just like first year comps, you might get a question like, which of the following chi is found in the chest and regulates the heartbeat? You need to know like, oh, that's the zong chi. That's the one that you see here stored in the chest, regulates heartbeat. Which type of chi is in the exterior and protects us from pathogens? You got to know, oh, that's the wei chi or defensive chi, that kind of stuff. Again, these are all very straightforward questions. They're typically one-liners. It's just like which type of chi does this, and then you select your answer. So again, not the key thing is not overthinking, just applying what you know. There are things, I hate to say it, but there are things where it really is just memorization. It's just definitions, knowing how the type of chi is defined and answering accordingly. If you start applying some kind of critical thinking to it, you're going to overthink it. You're going to come up with what you think Chinese medicine should be rather than just what is defined. And that's what you want to be careful about. The seven emotions, don't worry about how it says seven emotions and six here. It's just a couple of them are combined because they basically have the same effect on chi. But the general terminology that's often used is they refer to the seven emotions. But a couple of them, like, shock, fright, kind of overlap. So I just wrote them together here. But basically, you will get questions potentially on what do the emotions make chi do? So like anger makes chi rise. That's why somebody gets angry. They might get a red face, ringing ears, pounding headache. The idea is anger is making chi rise, and that mostly affects the liver. Things like fear makes chi descend, mostly affects the kidneys. That's why, you might get something like urinary incontinence when you're really scared. So again, you just want to know these things. Another, just, and again, another thing that you have to be careful about with comps or really any exam with TCM is don't apply your own independent reasoning. We were thinking, well, when I get angry, this happens. It's like, I mean, again, if you completely forget the material we give you in the comp review class and what you learned in your courses, then of course, I mean, try to figure it out however you can, right? But as a general rule, a lot of this stuff is already defined, and you just want to give like the accepted TCM answer. If you go down the road, well, when I get fearful, I kind of notice my heart starts racing. So therefore, I think that fear speeds up the chi or something like that. You're not going to come up with the correct answer. So again, you just have to know what's here. Don't overthink it. Then just a few more definition type things. You might remember we have things like Jin fluids and Ye liquids. This is just a basic definition. Jin fluids are the fluids that are considered more yang in nature. So they're thinner, they're more on the surface, more the yang surface, the outer part of the body. Things like sweat, tears, saliva. Yay liquids are the ones that are considered more yin in nature. They're more internal, they're thicker, denser. So those are the things that are more like cerebrospinal fluid and stuff like that, synovial fluid. Again, not too much would come up here, just a basic definition. You could just simply get a question that says something like, which of the following would be considered a gin fluid? And the options might say synovial fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, inner humors of the eyeball, or tears. And you'd have to know, like, oh, gin fluids, that would be tears. So, any questions on anything so far? Like, I know I'm running through it quickly because this is just a very brief reminder of things that you already studied for first year comps, just kind of running through it. So, the people that are just listening to the recordings kind of hear the gist of I need to know this. And it gives a chance to ask questions if you have any.
Do we have the link for today's video so we can listening while we're driving?
The video, today's video? Yeah. I
Yes.
mean, every class is recorded. I mean, it's not there yet because we're doing the class right now, but like when the class is over, the recording of the class will post just like it does for all the online classes, if that's what you mean, unless I'm misunderstanding you.
Yeah, sometimes we can download the Zoom recording, but sometimes we cannot. You know,
Hmm.
you download, I can put in the small disk and plug into a car if we cannot download.
I don't know. That would be an IT question. I don't really know, like, as far as that goes, why sometimes you would be able to download it and sometimes not. My understanding is the recordings are not available for download. You can listen to them, but you need like an internet connection that you can't download them because there's concern. And this is a college thing and how the Zoom software works. It's not something I could do anything about. My understanding is that because there's copyright and stuff like that, they don't just want the videos being able to be downloaded by everybody, indefinitely. But you should be able to access the recordings and listen to them while you're driving. But if it really is the case that like sometimes you can download them and sometimes not, that would be an IT question because that all has to do with how the Zoom software is set up in the Moodle shell. It's nothing that I have any control over. So you could always place a support ticket and ask if something's not working right. Okay. Any other questions on anything so far? All right, so this thing here, this topic, cause of disease, etiology, this is something that it's a really easy thing, but for whatever reason, every single term, when the deans, department chairs look at the results of the exam, we always take a second look at any questions where a certain percentage of students miss the question. We always give it a second look to make sure it was a fair question, to make sure it was keyed correctly, that it wasn't like the wrong answer was entered or something like that. So we always double check those things. And for whatever reason, there's a couple of questions related to this topic that consistently are highly missed, even though it's a super straightforward, pretty easy topic. Not really sure. Again, I think it's the kind of thing of people rather than committing to memory the defined answer, people are trying to put it through their own like rational thinking skills. So here's basically how this works. Causes a disease, or we might call this etiology of disease. There's basically three categories in Chinese medicine. There's internal causes, external causes, and miscellaneous causes. It's literally this simple. Internal causes are the emotions. So if somebody is getting ill because of, and we're saying in the question that it's due to stress, too much worry, grief, anything like that, that's an internal cause of disease, period. That's it. External causes are basically all the weather stuff. So if we say somebody has a wind attack, a wind cold attack, they were exposed to, a damp environment and now they're, phlegmy or something. Anything like that's weather related, wind heat, wind cold, wind dampness, sleeping in a damp basement and then waking up and kind of, feeling groggy and mucusy. Anything weather related like that, that's an exterior cause. That's external. Literally everything else is in the third category, miscellaneous. So constitution, meaning genetics, that kind of thing, essence, miscellaneous. Overwork, overtaxation, miscellaneous. Too much sexual activity, and now they're all like tired and lethargic, miscellaneous. Bad diet, miscellaneous. Parasites, miscellaneous. It's literally that simple. Emotions internal, the weather stuff external, literally everything else miscellaneous. Answer it accordingly, you get the questions right. But I think what some people do is, again, if you apply your own logic, you might think like, oh, well, constitution, like that sounds internal, right? That's the genetics you were born with or the gene you were born with. That kind of sounds internal. So they select internal. Or diet, people might think, well, that's food that was from outside of my body that I just put into my body. So, all right, that's an external cause. But again, it's all predefined, miscellaneous. So just don't overthink it. The people in the review, if you don't take the review class, then okay, maybe it's been a while since you looked at this. But if you're in the review class, you have this handout, there's really no excuse for anybody to miss these questions. They're literally that simple. Any questions about that? Extraordinary organs, again, straight memorization. You just got to know it's the brain, uterus, bones, etc. But again, another good example of something where it could be overthought because skin, you may know that skin is the largest organ in the body. That's one of those questions that sometimes comes up. What's the largest organ in the body? Skin is the answer. So you might think skin should be an extraordinary organ, but from a TCM perspective, it doesn't make the list. So you just got to know what is on the list. Again, predefined, not something for you to overthink. Of course, all the Zhang Fu stuff, you got to know like the liver maintains the free flow of qi, the spleen does transformation and transportation, small intestine separates the pure from the turbid. You got to recognize those things. Those things definitely come up still. Again, pretty much memorization. And hopefully by this point, a lot of the stuff we're mentioning here, hopefully a lot of it you already know. It's just a matter of kind of going through this and just kind of checking it off as either I already know that, I know I'll answer that correctly, and maybe highlighting the things that you're like, oh God, I always forget that. And then review the things you're highlighting. the spirit of the organs, you got to know things like the liver houses the hoon, or what we call the ethereal soul, and that's generally the spirit that goes along with planning and things like that, making goals. The kidney houses the jur, which is considered to be like the willpower and stuff like that. So, if you got a question of like, where is the hoon housed? You need to know that's the liver. What organ is most responsible or most associated with willpower? You got to know, oh, that's the kidneys. So things like that. Again, they're very straightforward questions. That's why I'm able to go through it relatively quickly. They're very straightforward questions. It's just a matter of making sure that you give it another review, because if it's not fresh in your head, it's easy to make some simple mistakes. And then lastly, on this handout, there's the parts of the eye and stuff that relate to different organs. So you may remember that the sclera is said to relate to the lung, and the pupil to the kidney, and so on. That kind of stuff can come up. So yeah, this is a handout that there's a lot of potential questions in this one. I would say this handout, out of the 60 questions, this handout probably covers a good 20 of them. If you know the key things in this handout, it's probably going to get you close to 20 out of the 60 questions on the OM theory, or Chinese medicine theory section. And again, you've already done this. You're all already past first year comps, and it's the same universe of material. Any questions about this handout? The other thing that there's going to be a handful of questions about for still the Chinese medicine theory section is the 5 elements. So the 5 elements, oops, you want to make sure you know this spreadsheet pretty well. I'll tell you that you could cross out yin yang all the way down to planets. That just happened to come with this particular chart that I got from one of those review books, but I've never seen those come up on comps. So you can cross out yin yang down to planets. I've never seen anything about domestic animals come up or anything like that, or what grains. But pretty much everything else on this spreadsheet is fair game. You gotta know which characteristics, which structures go with the wood element versus the fire element, etc. And again, they're straightforward multiple choice questions. So the questions would be something like, usually you have to know a handful of things to answer the question. So usually the question will be phrased something like, which of the following all correspond to the wood element? And then the correct answer would be something like gallbladder, green, anger, sour, something like that. All those things would be listed in one option. So like option A would say gallbladder, comma, green, comma, anger, comma, sour. And you'd have to recognize, okay, all those things go with wood. Wrong answers will include, the wrong answers might include some things from the wood column, but they might mix in things from other columns. And you have to recognize, oh, this is not the correct answer because, let's say, for example, it says liver, anger, sinews, and bitter. You'd have to recognize, oh no, bitter goes with fire. So that's not the right answer. So they could do something like that where it looks partially correct. But if you don't read it fully, if you don't read it carefully, you might think that something looks like a correct answer. So make sure you read all the characteristics, because the correct answer, they all have to correspond to the element that's being asked about. But again, that's straightforward memorization. You did it for first year. It's nothing overly complicated. It's just something that you have to refresh. And I guarantee that at this point, most of you know most of this. There just might be certain things like, oh, I always forget the smell or something like that. I always forget which smell goes with which. I always confuse rotten and putrid. Like, there may be some things like that. But at this point, you probably know most of it. Then also on the five elements, this handout here, you want to make sure you know the cycle. You want to make sure you know the generating cycle, or like wood generates, or you could say engenders fire, fire engenders earth, earth engenders metal, then water, and so on. And make sure you know the terminology, like, wood is considered to be the mother of fire. The mother engenders her child. Wood is the mother of fire. Fire is the child of wood. Make sure you know like things like that terminology. And then remember there's the controlling cycle. You may remember in Chinese medicine, the grandmother is considered to be the controller. So, like, wood controls the element that's two generations ahead. So wood is the grandmother of Earth, and therefore wood controls Earth, wood restrains Earth. That has to do with Chinese medicine, like the historical culture, where like the parents were more like nurturing and caring about the children. And it's a little different from American culture. The grandparents are more the ones that were about enforcing tradition and strictness and that kind of thing. Where, American culture, it's a little more like the grandparents are the ones that spoil the grandkids. But this concept, came from way back when, different culture. So the grandparent is the controller here. So again, make sure you know the cycle, how it works, that essentially one generation ahead, is the generating cycle. And the two generations ahead, that's the controlling cycle. And know you the terminology like grandmother, mother, child, that kind of thing. Any questions on that? And then lastly on this topic, make sure that you can at least recognize and understand the pathological relationships. So the normal relationship is, that for example, wood nourishes or engenders or generates fire, and wood controls earth. Those are normal things that you would expect. But a pathological example would be like somebody you can see here with an excess wood element. Wood would essentially over control earth. Excess wood over controls earth or overacts on earth. Or you could say the liver overacts on the spleen. Make sure that you could recognize some of the pathological relationships that are kind of referenced here. And there's another handout also in your class handouts that I'll pull up here. Here it is. This here that lists some of the pathological relationships. So you could see like wood not generating the child. So wood not generating fire, wood overacting on earth. And it gives you some of the signs and symptoms and such. I gave you a handout that spells it out, but a lot of the times on a multiple choice question, as long as you keep your cool, you can usually recognize the correct answer because you'll basically get a question that will give you some signs and symptoms. So like let's say you get a question about wood overacting on earth. It'll tell you that the patient has hypochondriac pain, distension, they're irritable, they have loose stools, poor appetite. They might even tell you like wiry pulse, things like that. Well, if you basically know like your symptoms and your pattern differentiation, you'd probably see like, well, hypochondriac pain, irritability, wiry pulse sounds like liver. Low appetite, loose stool sounds like spleen. And then it's sort of like, well, all right, what elements are those? Well, liver goes with wood, spleen goes with earth. So just on that, like very basic understanding, that on a multiple choice test, you're looking for the answer that says something about wood and earth. If it says something about the other elements, those are wrong options. So right off the bat, you're kind of narrowed down to an answer that says something about wood and earth just by a very basic understanding. And then you could always say, well, like, I know the normal relationship between wood and earth is that wood controls earth. I know that's the normal relationship. This person has a pathology. So, like, which one of these answers kind of represents a pathological version of wood controlling earth? And, and then that kind of takes you to the right answer. Oh, wood's over controlling or overacting on earth. So my point is that I'm giving you this handout that does spell it all out. It does list all the patterns, signs, and symptoms. Certainly, you can memorize it if you want to, but I don't think you really have to. With a multiple choice test, a lot of times, just a very basic understanding can get you to arrive at the right answer. In all seriousness, most of the time when somebody's asking me to look at their exam and I'm looking and they have a miss on something like this, most of the time it's like the patient had hypochondriac pain, irritability, wiry pulse, loose stools, poor appetite, and they selected the answer that said something like wood insulting metal. And I'm like, metal? Like what organs are metal? And they'll tell me, they're like, oh, metal, that's the lungs. I'm like, well, do you see any shortness of breath? Do you see any coughing? Do you see any lung signs? No. Then why did you pick the answer with metal? Most of the time, when people get the wrong answers, it's just they're doing things like that. It's not that the question is really all that difficult. They're just panicking, and in the moment, they pick an answer that really just doesn't go with what's there. So, again, all these things are things for you to take a look at because you already had it on first year comps, just kind of reminding you. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? Okay. And another, we're moving along here. Like I said, the first day, there's a lot of handouts to give you, but we're moving along here. Hold on, I'm just going to close some of these handouts we've already used just because there's a lot on my screen that I have to filter through. So, okay, here we go. So, last couple things with the OM theory section. This handout, you may recall, this is something that I made that you might recall from the first year comps. It's things like it's telling you the pulse positions, what pulse positions go with what organs. It's telling you, again, the areas of the tongue, the 8 principles, excess heat, that kind of thing. And then it goes through all the patterns. It goes through all the key patterns and tells you what tongue, what pulse are associated with those patterns, what kinds of signs and symptoms you should expect. And this is a very narrowed down list. This is not going through literally every single complex pattern that exists, but you don't really need that. Like most of the questions that come up on the Chinese medicine theory section of comps are like your pretty basic, most common patterns. And even when you do sometimes get a pattern that's a little more complicated, if you focus on the tongue and pulse, oftentimes there's really only one answer that makes sense. If you select the answer that matches the tongue and the pulse, like for example, there's a red tongue, so you select the answer that has heat in the pattern, or there's a greasy tongue coating, so you select the answer that talks about dampness or phlegm. If you do that, you're going to get most of the questions right. There's always going to be a few that are a little random, a little, all right, maybe not the best questions, but you don't need to get a 100. You just need to pass. So this is something to take another look at. Make sure you're confident with what tongues, what pulses go with what general patterns, what signs and symptoms make it liver blood deficiency versus heart blood deficiency, or kidney yang deficiency versus spleen yang deficiency. You want to take a look at that kind of stuff. And if you go through this, basically do the same thing you did for first year comps, you should do fine. You should do fine on most of the questions. And a key thing is that with anytime you're taking a standardized test, there's always going to be the occasional random question like, oh no, I didn't study this particular thing. I'm not sure what this term means. There's always going to be something like that. There's no way that you could literally study and commit to memory every single thing that could possibly come up. There's no way I could design a review course that could capture without making it so overwhelming in volume that I might as well just say study everything. There's no way I could design a review course that would cover every single possible word that could be used. But the key thing is like accept that you don't have to get a 100. It's okay if you have some questions like that, as long as you're getting 70% of them. And if you study the stuff that I'm telling you to study here, you should have no trouble getting at least the minimum 70%, if not well over that. Mm. So don't let a random question here or there throw you completely off track. I know that happens to some people sometimes. They get one or two questions that they're like, oh no, and then they just go into a tailspin. Got to do your best to just breathe, keep your cool, show what you know. It's okay if you don't know everything. And on the same general topic, some of the patterns you might get asked about are the Shanghan Lun patterns and the Wenbing patterns, otherwise known as the 6 stages or the 4 levels. Again, this was on first year comps. Just make sure you could recognize that you look at the signs and symptoms and you could recognize what's the difference between Taiyang wind strike, Taiyang cold damage, Shaoyang disharmony, Yang Ming channel, Yang Ming organ, you know, Wei level, Qi level. If you know what's here, you should get most of these questions fine because most of them have real big standout things that kind of give it away. It's like, like the alternating fever and chills is a big giveaway for Xiaoyang, right? Constipation is kind of a big giveaway for Yangming organ. Vomiting roundworms is a big giveaway for Shui Yin. So like a lot of them have big standouts that are going to give them away if you're trying to determine if it's one thing versus the other. And again, this stuff gets so reinforced throughout the program, comes up again and again, like all the patterns, the tongues, the pulses. That's why by the time you get to second year comps, and this is why, like, all we really do in the review class is I just kind of remind you of these things in the first hour of the first class. Almost nobody fails the second year OM section. Almost nobody. It's very rare. So if you do what you did for first year, you should be fine. And this basically it. Look at the stuff that we gave you here, the sort of a directed study. You do that, you should have no problem passing. So anybody have any questions about the second year Chinese medicine theory section and basically what you have to look at, the kinds of things that are going to come up? Anybody have any questions on any of that? So I know it feels a little overwhelming because we mention a bunch of things, but again, it's all stuff you've already done. You already did it for first year. So that's a good breaking point. So why don't we take 10 minutes and then we'll start with going over the acupuncture section. So take 10 minutes and then we'll go over acu when we get back. All right, everybody, let's continue. Does anybody have any questions on anything so far?
And just let you know, I have to leave at 2:50.
Oh yeah, no problem. The class doesn't have an attendance requirement, so whatever. It's all good.
Yeah, I have the needle technique lab, needle lab.
Oh, fun. Enjoy that. That's always that's always a fun class. Any other questions? All right, so you should at this point have a pretty good idea of what to expect for the Chinese medicine theory section, and basically that it's the same type of material from first year ends. You just have to review it again and get it fresh in your head. It's very seldom that somebody doesn't pass. Generally speaking, that's a subject that most people do well on because again, at this point, people have most of the foundational Chinese medicine theory stuff down pretty well. It's just a matter of reviewing things that may not be as fresh in your head, like what color goes with Earth and that kind of thing. All right, so now going to the acupuncture section. Again, we already mentioned the acupuncture section is 60 questions. Again, multiple choice. And out of those 60 questions, I would say about 45 of them, about three quarters, in other words, enough to pass, is just the same stuff as first year, the same universe of material. It's points 1 through 3, all the stuff like point locations, point functions, channel pathways, all that stuff, soon measurements, all that stuff you learn for your first year comps. About three quarters of it is that. Because I mean, that doesn't change, right? I mean, there's no new additional points. I mean, you learned all those points already. There's no additional point locations. There's no additional point function. I mean, that's all the same stuff that you already learned. So I would say about approximately 75% of it is that material. So if you know that stuff well, that could be enough to pass. Then the additional 15 or so questions are basically from the auricular class and from the secondary vessels class. So there are some questions on, certainly point locations in the ear, and there's questions about the things like the Chong and the Yang Ming, or not the Yang Ming, the Yang Chao and Yin Chao and those kinds of channels. The point combos class to some degree could be on there, but I would say the point combos class comes up more in the case study section as opposed to the acupuncture section, generally speaking. So for the most part, you just have to review the things that you already studied for first year. And then in the coming weeks, we'll go over the stuff that's more uniquely second year. So I'll go over the secondary vessels with you and what you should focus on as far as the yin chao, the yang chao, and all that goes. And I'll go over the auricular with you, and we could really narrow that down. Like auricular, we could really narrow down. Like basically, you take a whole course in auricular, however many weeks, 12 weeks or something like that, and we pretty much can cover what you need to know about auricular in about a half an hour. So we'll really narrow that down. So today, I'm just going to kind of give you the overview of some things to start taking a look at that should be a reminder from things from first year. And then in the future classes, we'll go over the secondary vessels and auricular and all those things. All right. So first off, soon measurements. Of course, if you don't at this point know your soon measurements, you want to do a little reminder of those. There are still going to be questions about things like the how many soon is it from the anterior axillary fold to the cubital crease, or you could say to the elbow. How many soon is it from the elbow to the carpal crease, or you could say to the wrist. If you don't already have that stuff down, take a look at what's here and make sure you have those soon measurements committed to memory, just like first year. And again, one thing to be on the lookout for, just like first year, is sometimes they will combine two soon measurements. So make sure you read the whole thing, the whole question. Don't just jump to what you think the question is going to be asking. Because sometimes, for example, instead of asking how many soon is it from the anterior axillary fold to the cubital crease, they'll ask you how many soon it is from the anterior axillary fold to the carpal crease. And then you have to add two Soon measurements together. You have to know that it's 9 to the elbow and then additional 12 to the wrist. So 9 plus 12 is 21. So just make sure it's pretty straightforward math. It's nothing complicated. It just make sure you read it carefully. Sometimes people jump the gun on what they think the question is about to ask, and then they don't answer it completely. But that's pretty much it. Make sure you know your Soon measurements as far as that goes. Not really much I could do to narrow that down. You just got to know your Soons. Then point location. Now, this is really just meant as a reminder to study point locations, because this handout here, you may recall it from first year, is a really concise list of basically where the points are located. Like it says here, for example, for lung 2, corner pocket, right? Or lung 3, 3 below fold. On the actual exam, you're going to get the more formal definition. So, like for lung 3, it's not going to just say 3 below fold. It'll say like 3 Soon distal to the anterior axillary fold on the lateral aspect of the bicep, between the bicep and the humerus, something along those lines, the more formal definition. So you can use this as a means of studying as just sort of a quick reminder of basically where the points are located. You can use it for that purpose. But of course, make sure that on an exam, you can recognize the more formal spelled out definition. Right? Because every point location is fair game. There's really no way I can narrow it down. This is primarily an acupuncture program. That is the focus of most students. I mean, it's Chinese medicine, but I would say most students are in the program to become acupuncturists. Certainly, all the acupuncture point locations are fair game for a comprehensive exam. So this is just something that there's really no way I can narrow it down or make it any easier. I can't tell you, oh, they'll only ask these points. You have to know your point locations. So that's just something like, again, most of them you probably do already know at this point. I'm sure you know a lot of them. You use them in clinic, you use them in class, but there's some you probably have to remind yourself of. I mean, honestly, if I had to take a test tomorrow, there'd be some I have to remind myself of. I don't remember where stomach 31 is. Who uses that point? So there's going to be some points like that we all have to remind ourselves of. Okay. But this is just a reminder to make sure you do look at your point locations. Then, of course, the big picture. That's what they typically call this handout with all the point categories. This is another thing where there's really not much I could do to narrow this down for you. At this point in the program, you got to know like what points are chi cleft points, what points are source points, because those are the most commonly used acupuncture points. The points that fall into those categories, the back shoes, the front moves, the influential points of the sinews, of the blood, the chi clefts. I mean, those are the most commonly used points. So at this point, if you still question, like, oh, what's the chi cleft point? Something you really want to just work on getting that all committed to memory. I'll tell you, like, I recall when I was a student, there was some point where, I don't know, is it points 2, points 3, whatever. And it was like, the same thing keeps coming up. It's like every term, okay, now there's a quiz, now there's a midterm, now there's a final. And for all of them, you got to remember what's the chi cleft point, what's the source point. There was finally one day where I didn't even have a particular test coming. I just sat down and I'm like, I'm going to go over this again and again until I just know it cold. So I don't have to just keep studying it every term. And it worked. Like one day I just kind of did that. And, then you get to the point where it's just like you're done. You don't have to restudy it every term. So if there is anything like this where you just, you don't know it at this point, you may want to just give yourself a day where you just study it to death. So you just really put it in that long-term memory and then you just sort of got it for life. There's always going to be the occasional one you forget and you have to remind yourself, but you basically know them all. So this pretty much all fair game. And usually the way they ask the questions is similar to what I was saying about the 5 elements. They might give you a question that says something like, which of the following are all chi cleft points? And then the correct answer might say something like this: lung 6, LI 7, stomach 34, spleen 8. And then a wrong answer might be partially correct. It might say stomach 34, spleen 8, but maybe these flip. Maybe it says lung 7 and LI6 or something. And you have to recognize that's wrong because those are the low points on the channel, not the chi clef points. So again, just study this until you really know it. And one thing I just want to remind people of, don't forget about the chi clef points on the extraordinary meridians or the luo points on the ren and the du. Because every once in a while, there's a question where it'll say, like, which of the following are all chi clef points? And it'll say, like, kidney 8, for example. And a lot of people will go, oh, well, that can't be the right answer because the chi clef point of the kidney is kidney 5. But remember, kidney 8 is a chi clef point. It's the chi clef point of the yin chow. And that every once in a while, there's a few questions in the test bank like that, and those always get people. Because we do give comment cards where students can comment if they think a question was unfair or something. And a lot of times for these questions, for a question like that, students will comment, there's no right answer here. Or back in the day when the exam was on campus and I was in the proctor, students would come up and like point it out to me and say, there isn't a right answer here. And I just have to be like, there is a right answer. I can't say anything, because it's your comp exam, but there is a right answer. I promise you. Is any questions about that or, again, anything so far? Then another topic that comes up in the acupuncture section is the channel pathologies. So the way they typically ask these questions is, essentially what the channel pathologies are their signs and symptoms that generally speaking, we would use a certain channel to treat. So somebody comes in with a bad cough, like what channel would be your go-to channel? Probably most likely the lung. Somebody comes in with a stomach ache, what's your go-to channel? Probably the stomach channel, right? So the way they tend to ask these questions is they'll say something like, which of the following, similar to what we are saying with the chi clef points and stuff, which of the following are all channel pathologies of the lung? And then the correct answer will say something like cough, asthma, hemoptysis, which is coughing up blood, chest pain, something like that. Which of the following are all channel pathologies of the small intestine? And it might say like yellow sclera, deafness, swelling of the cheek. Most of the channel pathologies you're going to find are kind of common sense, right? Like lung going with cough or going with asthma, kind of common sense. Heart going with palpitations and cardiac pain, kind of common sense. But there's always going to be a few because remember they're called channel pathologies. So not all of them relate to the organ functions. Sometimes they relate to something about the channel pathway. So, like for example, the large intestine toothache, that's because the large intestine channel goes up to the face, wraps around the mouth, enters the lower gums, and that's why the large intestine channel can be used to treat toothache. Or, stomach 4 is on the sides of the mouth. Basically it's found at the corner of the mouth. That's why the stomach channel could treat deviation of the mouth, like if the person had a stroke or something. So there's certain things that are going to be obvious, like cough for lung and diarrhea for large intestine, but there's going to be certain things that only make sense from a channel pathway point of view. So, what I suggest is read through this. If there's something that like, oh yeah, that's obvious, okay, know that you'll probably know that. But if there is something that's like, oh, I don't think I'd remember epistaxis for LI or toothache for LI, highlight those things. And then those are the things to review, multiple times. So the questions are very straightforward as long as you've had a look at this and you recognize particularly the less obvious pathologies. All right. Then we have this handout. This also from first year ends, nothing new here yet. This is the AccuTechniques handout. Here you might get some questions about like when would you use moxa? When would moxa be contraindicated? When would you do cupping? When would cupping be contraindicated? Now, again, a lot of this stuff is somewhat common sense, right? Like if the person has a high fever, you probably don't want to do moxa. Like, why would you want to add more heat if they already have a high fever? So certain things on this are going to be relatively common sense as long as you don't panic and you just kind of trust what makes sense. But still, some of these things may not be as obvious. So, take a look through, highlight the things that are not obvious to you. And those are the things to make sure you review again and again. Again, moxa being used to treat cold, duh. But maybe it's not as obvious to you that moxa induces the smooth flow of qi and blood, for example. So take a look at this. It includes all the side techniques, lancet, which is bleeding. It includes plum blossom. And again, notice it's very to the point. It's a couple little bullets about each. What do you use it for? When might it be contraindicated? Then this includes tonification, sedation techniques, things like rotating clockwise, rotating counterclockwise. Things you have to be cautious about, like not needling somebody if they haven't eaten or if they're intoxicated. Certain rules regarding pregnancy. What if the patient faints? Needling obliquely over the organs so as not to give a pneumothorax, for example. So, just things like that. And again, what I recommend is start now, don't wait. At least at the beginning, look at least one handout a day. Read through it, read through the whole thing. If something's obvious, you probably don't have to read it a bunch of times. But if there's something that you're like, yeah, I didn't know that, or I'm going to forget that, those are the things to highlight and kind of keep reviewing. And again, that was all on first year comps. Anyone have any questions on that? Then I included all of the handouts for all of the channels. So all of the handouts where, you know, um, I go over like the lung channel starts in the middle jiao and it enters these organs, and here are the crossing points, and here's what this point is most commonly used for. So things like, lung six is the chi cleft point that it's used to moderate acute conditions and treat bleeding disorders. Again, all that stuff from first year comps, I included all those handouts. It's just exactly the same things you study for first year. Just give another look see at all that. Again, you're seeing it's a lot of the same stuff. We'll review some of the newer stuff, but there's a lot of the same stuff to just take a look at. All right. Along those same lines, I included the handout showing the extraordinary points. Oops, I selected the wrong thing. Where's the thing I want to share? Here we go, the extraordinary points. There's a couple handouts showing the extraordinary point locations. You want to make sure you know where they are, both for the written questions, because you do get asked about extraordinary point written questions, as well as there's always typically, almost always, every version of the practical has one extraordinary point on it. Almost always. You might occasionally get lucky and you get a version of the practical that doesn't have an extraordinary point, but pretty much every version of the practical has one extraordinary point on it. So you want to know where your extraordinary points are. And those are the ones that typically throw students off. Students come to the exam because I'm usually one of the proctors in the room. And here's the side of the extraordinary handout that shows the functions or the indications, what you use them for. I'm usually one of the proctors in the room for the acupuncture practical. And it's kind of amazing to me. Like, I think sometimes we'll just get nervous, but like, you're preparing for the comps, you want to pass. And how many times students come into the room and it's just like they get one of the more basic extraordinary points and they have no idea what it is. So you want to make sure that you do take a look at them. Any questions about that? Last couple things on the acupuncture section. Again, I know the first day is a little overwhelming here, but this will at least give you a good overview of what to start on. This will hand out, this was on first year comps, the depths of the meridians. So you may get some basic. This is like a day one of points one kind of thing. It's not something that comes up a lot, but like day one of points one, you may remember they introduce you to the concept of the cutaneous regions, which basically is the skin. So you only needle very shallowly, very superficially if you're just trying to affect the cutaneous regions because it's the most superficial. Then, if you needle a little deeper, you get into the muscle meridians, also known as the sinew channels or sinew meridians. So it's a little deeper. Then you go deeper, you get into the collaterals, sometimes called the Luo connecting channels, or even sometimes called the Luo collaterals. Those are said to pretty much relate to the little blood vessels under the skin. So you go a little deeper, you're kind of getting to that level. And only then, going a little deeper than that, is when you get into the primary channels. Then a little deeper are the divergent channels. Then the deepest are the extraordinary meridians. There's not a lot of questions on this topic, but you could get some questions like, which of the following is deepest? Which of the following is most superficial? That kind of thing. So you want to make sure you know that, like, the muscle meridians are superficial to the primary channels. You want to make sure you know that divergent meridians are considered to be deeper than the primary channels. Just basically that, just the order of depth. If you know that, you'll be fine as far as this stuff goes. There's not really too much that comes up here. All right. Any questions on any of that? All right. Let's get some things out of here. And the last thing for the acupuncture section that I want to emphasize as far as things to start taking a look at, things from first year, is you may remember everybody's favorite, the 4-point needle technique, sometimes called the Korean technique. This is the one where they might tell you that you learn this like the last couple weeks of points 3. And this is the one where they might tell you, like, a patient has spleen chi deficiency using the 4-point needle technique or using the Korean technique. Which of the following treatments would you use? And it'll tell you, like, tonify these 2 points, sedate these 2 points, tonify those 2 points, sedate those 2 points. What I recommend with this, we don't want to devote, because there's only probably a couple of questions that would come up relating to this out of the 60. So it wouldn't really be a good use of our time to devote a lot of class time to really going over this in depth, because this is one of those things that people have a lot of trouble with. They tend to, it's not intuitive. It's a whole, like, kind of complicated scenario of how to figure out which points to tonify, which points to sedate, and so on. So what I would just recommend is try to go through a few practice examples on your own. Use this handout to check if you're coming up with the right answer. This is another one of those things that one day I just sat down and I just said, I'm going to go over this until I just have it, until I just know it. Not cram it the night before a test. I'm just going to devote an afternoon to going over this and going through multiple scenarios until it's just like, I know how to do this and I'm done. I never have to think about it again. Anytime it comes up again, I know how to do it. And really, if you devote like one afternoon to just going over it and practicing and checking your answers, once you have it down, you'll have it down for life and you'll be set. If you're always just cramming it the night before an exam, then it probably won't stick. So this gives you the correct answer for all of the examples. All of the examples. So if somebody has, a liver deficiency, here are the 4 points you'd use. Which ones you tonify, which ones you sedate. If they have a liver excess, here are the points that you use. With 2 of them you tonify, 2 of them you sedate. So something to just practice. Now, I'll just give you a little clue. You always know, and this might on a multiple choice test be enough. You may not even have to really figure it out if you just know the general rule. There's always going to be 2 points from the affected channel. So if it's a liver pattern that you're treating, there's always going to be one liver point you tonify and one liver point you sedate in both scenarios, whether it's a deficient condition where you're trying to tonify the liver or an excess where you're sedating the liver. There's always going to be 2 points on the affected channel. One of them tonified, one of them sedated. Same thing here. If you go to the spleen, notice there's 2 spleen points. One's tonified, one's sedated. So if you keep that in mind, that there's always going to be 2 points from the affected meridian, one of them being tonified, one of them being sedated, on a multiple choice exam, you might be able to, just knowing that, rule out some things. So I recommend don't devote too much time to this because it's not going to get you a lot of questions. But it might be worth just devoting like one afternoon early on, not the night before the exam, early on, devote one afternoon to just sitting down and going through every scenario and without notes and go over it until you just have it. You just know how to do it. And that's it. Then you're done. So again, happy to answer any questions if people like start practicing on their own and then they're like, all right, Matt, give me some help on this. I'm happy to try to help you go through it. But as you know, probably from doing this in class, this is one of those things that it's convoluted. You just kind of have to get used to doing it. So any questions, comments regarding that? All right. No good. That one's done. That one's done. So that covers the acupuncture section. And we'll go over, like I said, together, we'll go over some of the new second year stuff we'll narrow it down for you. So in a couple of the next few weeks, we'll go over the extraordinary meridians, we'll go over auricular, we'll narrow that stuff down. The stuff that we've already covered is stuff that you already did for first year. So we're just reminding you. The bio section, we already said 60 questions, multiple choice. The bio section will go over pretty much everything together because the bio section is usually with our acupuncture students, kind of gives them the most grief, that and herbs. And also, the bio section is the section that has the most uniquely second year material. If we go up to here where it breaks down, this is the study guide the school puts out. If we go up to here where it breaks down the bio section, sorry, it's a big handout that I got to scroll through here, but where it breaks down the bio section, there's somewhere, here we go. It gives you the breakdown. There's 22 questions from anatomy physiology, 16 from your O&E series, so both O&E 1 and 2 in total. You got 16 questions from the O&E series and 16 questions from pathophysiology, again, a combo of 1 and 2, and then 6 pharmacology questions. Now, if you are in the MSAC program, which is the acupuncture only program in New York, that's set up a little bit differently. If you're in that program, you won't get pharmacology questions. So don't stress if you're one of those people that's like, wait, I haven't had pharmacology. If you're in the MSAC program and you've not taken pharmacology yet, you will get a different version of the test. It's up to you to know which program you're in. But if you are in this program and you've not had pharmacology yet, you will receive a different exam that doesn't contain the pharmacology. So don't stress about that. But most people are in, I don't even know how to say this, the massage, whatever you want to say that is. But that's the 22 anatomy, 16 orthoneuro, 16 path, and 6 pharmacology questions. Here, there's not really much I'm going to go over with you up front. We'll go over this little by little together because I'll narrow down the key things because that's pretty broad, right? Pathophysiology, 16 questions. I mean, there's a lot of disorders you learn in pathophysiology. Like, what should I focus on? So we'll go over that. And as we're going over that, I'll remind you of the anatomy. So as we go over, say, the cardiovascular system, and we talk about the pharmacology involved, and we talk about congestive heart failure, I'll remind you about, like, this is the left ventricle and it pumps blood into the aorta and stuff like that. So you'll get a recap and be pretty prepared for the bio stuff. We'll be doing that little by little throughout the classes starting today, actually. Starting today, we'll go over some pathophys. Right. So this will go over, that's coming. And then you have the law and safety section, 10 questions. This, just like with the OM theory section, the law and safety section is the exact same universe of material that you studied for first year comps. It's not from any one course. It includes things like clean needle technique type questions. It includes, things like definitions of cross infections and autogenous infections. What are universal precautions? It asks you some questions about things like hepatitis and HIV, other infectious disease that we have to be careful about in the clinic, MRSA. It also asks things like clinic policy and safety rules. When do you call 911? So I have this handout that I put together. It's the exact same handout from first year comps that goes into some of these things. So just like with your first year comps, it's very rare somebody fails this section. Just look at what's here, answer the questions accordingly. You shouldn't have any trouble. Again, there might be an occasional question that you're a little less sure of, but there really shouldn't be anything on there that's surprising. And one thing, just like I mentioned with first year comps, the law and safety section, also don't be afraid to just apply some common sense, because there's certain things where, like, maybe in this handout, I didn't spell out the exact procedure of hand washing or something like that. Because it's hard to anticipate like every single exact wording of every question, but like some of the stuff is just pretty straightforward. Like I've seen questions where it'll ask like which of the following is true regarding hand washing. And the correct answer just sounds like good, thorough hand washing, right? Using soap, water, getting between your fingers, going up the forearm a little bit, drying it with a paper towel. It just sounds like good, thorough hand washing. And the wrong answers are things like run your fingertips under cold water and shake them off. And it's just like, yeah, I don't think I have to specify in a handout that that's not good, thorough hand washing. So don't be afraid to just, even if a certain answer wasn't committed to memory word for word, don't be afraid to just apply common sense. Again, if there is something that you studied that were in the notes, go with the answer you know. But if there is something that, like, oh, I didn't commit this to memory, don't be afraid to just apply common sense. Don't panic. Like, not every single question that comes up is something that, is necessarily always going to be word for word specified. But you should know, like, from clinic experience, how things work and what's expected and things like that. So again, very rare that somebody doesn't pass this section. You should do fine as long as you look at this handout and just kind of keep your cool. All right. Does anybody have any questions on that? Then the last written section is the case study section. And our last class meeting, I'll go over that with you in a little more detail as far as what to focus on. But the case study section is a unique section to second. There was no case study section on the first year comps. But it really is, it's just kind of a combination of everything else. There's not really any unique separate material that you have to study for the case study section. It's just a combination of everything you already studied for the other sections. So for example, they'll give you a case study, like, just to make something up, a 32-year-old female comes into your office complaining of lower abdominal pain 2 days prior to menses. The pain's worse with pressure. There's clot when the person does menstruate. There's clots. The tongue is purple. The pulse is choppy. Like, something like that. A case study. And then they'll ask you questions about that case. But the questions are just all like the stuff that you've already studied for the other sections. what pattern does this person have? Hopefully, pretty obvious this person has blood stagnation based on what we were saying. They might ask you, what points would you use for this patient? That's where your point combo knowledge comes in. We'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the reviewing of the case studies towards the end of the review class. But they might ask you, what biomedical disorder is this referred to as? What lifestyle modifications might you recommend to this patient? It's basically things like that. It's just a combination of all the stuff that you studied for the other sections all in one place. So that's basically the case study section. There's no special information you have to study. It's just everything you already studied, bringing that knowledge to this section. Yes, everything is multiple choice. Except the only thing that's not multiple choice is the practical, right? The practical you have to perform. There's no multiple choice, but all the written section is multiple choice. Right. So that's the case study section. And that's all the written sections. That's an overview. Like at this point, you should have a good idea of the kinds of things to look at and study for the entirety of the written section. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, Ivy's here now. I didn't know we had somebody else sneak in. Very nice. Perfect. All right. So one last thing that we really already mentioned this, but just to kind of wrap up again the overview. Then remember the practical, you'll get an appointment time. So the written test is typically Wednesday of week 15. But always be on the lookout for emails from the school this term, like from the administration. If you're not so great about checking emails this term, make sure you check emails, whatever email the school has, because they're going to contact you about, you know, the dates, the times, sending you links for how to log in, all that stuff, giving you your appointment time for the practical. So make sure you are checking your emails. So, but typically, Wednesday of week 15 is the written. So you do that online at home at your computer. Thursday would be if you're doing herbs. So the herbs written is at home on your computer on Thursday of week 15. And then Friday typically is the day that you would get an appointment time to go for taking your practical. Sometimes it spills over to Saturday if there's a huge number of students, but usually it's all done in one day on Friday. Every once in a while, there's also a Saturday session. And this you'll just get appointment time. And remember what we were saying before. You're probably there for like 15 minutes. You have to locate 10 points in 10 minutes, applying stickers to the points on a piece of paper that looks something like this. Generally, I would say the proctors tend to be a little more generous on comps than they are in class because they recognize that in class you're there, they're grading it in front of you, they're giving you feedback. It's sort of a learning experience. You can fine tune it a little bit, but when it comes to comps, it's this sort of like all or nothing thing. You've left the room, they're grading it. And, if they mark you wrong on enough, it's going to cause you to not pass and have to retake it next term. So, as a general rule, they tend to be a little more forgiving, a little more generous on like nitpicky things. Basically the stickers in the area, they generally tend to give you credit. But again, you always want to aim to be as precise as possible. The only reason I'm even telling you this is just like, don't go in paranoid. Go in with a certain confidence that if you know where the points are, you're going to put the sticker there correctly and you'll likely get it correct. Because again, they're not trying to be overly nitpicky. Like the goal isn't to make people fail. The goal is to make sure people, have a good idea of where the points are. So if you're way off, there's nothing that can be done about it. But it usually is not going to come down to some very nitpicky, like, oh, I move it here. Now, don't rely on things that, like, again, some instructors might mention to you or your fellow classmates mates might mention, because just because that was somebody's experience a year ago, last term, or whatever, doesn't mean the college is bound by that. So again, you want to go into it knowing all your points. Technically, any point is fair game. I mean, realistically, are they going to put a point in the hair with for you to put a sticker? No, probably not. Are they going to give you Ren 1? No, probably not. But I wouldn't go in trying to like get away with, all right, what don't I have to know? You want to go in knowing your point locations as best as possible. Technically, anything's fair game. But certainly, there's regions that are more likely to get points than others, like the arm. Anything on the arm, you definitely want to know. The lower leg, like, mid thigh down, lots of points from there. Those are big, heavily, commonly used points. Certainly your back points, the center of the abdomen points. There's ones that are a little more likely to come up than others, but I wouldn't go in trying to like get away with what don't I have to know. Like, do your best to know your points as well as you can. Everything is technically fair game. All right. And again, you need to get 7 out of 10 correct to pass. Any questions about that? Exactly the same procedure as first year. And then lastly, you'll generally go to a separate room. I mean, every campus might be a little bit different in their exact procedure, but generally after your point location, you'll go into a separate room and you'll do clean needle technique. As I was saying previously, unlike first year, you don't have to do moxa or cupping. You just do clean needle technique. And this is the exact script that they use. This is the whole thing where they say, please set up your instruments and equipment. Tell me when you're ready for the next instruction. You set up your clean field, you put out your sharps container, make sure you wash your hands, all that. And, ultimately you have to put in one needle, and then close the hole, remove the needle, all that stuff. Again, just like first year. I'll just kind of tell you briefly that the things to be most careful about, the thing, like almost everybody passes this, but if somebody were to not pass, the things that most likely are culprits, you got to make sure you don't forget to wash your hands. So at a minimum, there should be 3 hand washes. Hand wash before you start doing anything. First thing, wash your hands. Then set your clean field up. Put everything out that you need. Put out your sharps container, separate. Put out your trash. Set up your clean field. All you need is 1 needle, 2 cotton balls. That's really all you need on it. Then the alcohol. Set all that up. Then wash your hands again because you just touched a bunch of stuff, including your kit and all that. So you contaminate yourself. Wash your hands again. So that's your second hand wash. Then they'll go to the next instruction. Please prepare any point on your leg for the insertion of a needle. So generally, just do this on yourself. All you need to do is pick up the cotton ball, alcohol it. You don't have to soak it, like not too much alcohol, just get a little alcohol, do a swab. I'm obviously showing my arm because I can't lift my leg up, but just do a swab. Cotton ball goes in the trash. So the second thing to be careful about, don't put anything used back on the clean field. Goes in the trash. Once it's used, it gets thrown out, not back on the clean field. That's the kind of thing that might cause you to not pass. So you've done that. Then they'll say, please insert a needle at least 1/4 of an inch deep at a 90-degree angle in the site you selected. Rotate the needle clockwise 1 full turn. Tell me when you're ready for the next instruction. So it's pretty straightforward, right? You pick up the needle, with the guide tube and everything, tap it in, put it in a little, give it a quick turn, throw the guide tube and everything in the trash. Again, not back on the clean field. Okay, you've done step 3. And then they'll say, please remove the needle, close the hole, dispose of used equipment, repack your kit, blah, blah, blah. So remove the needle, make sure it goes in the sharps container. It would definitely cause you to fail if you put that in the trash. So remember to make sure it goes in the sharps container. Take the other cotton ball, close the hole, that goes in the trash. Then everything left goes in the trash. Just, clean everything up. And then, of course, one more final, you're done hand washing. Basically, if you do those things, you'll be fine. Notice here how it says first pass failed and then second pass. Let's say you make a little mistake. Let's say you put the cotton ball back on the clean field. What they'll tell you is they'll say, okay, something was not right. We're going to give you a chance to do this again. Right? And if you, so the key thing there is don't panic because they're not going to tell you what you did. Because I mean, anybody could just follow an instruction. So if they say you put the cotton ball on the clean field, throw it out, I mean, anybody could do what they're told. So they're not going to tell you what you did, but they're just going to say, like, all right, we're going to have you redo that. You made a mistake. The key thing is, okay, clear your head. Don't panic. Just start from scratch and kind of go through your mind. What were the things that Matt said to emphasize? 3 hand washes. Don't put anything back in the clean field. Needle in the sharps container. Just kind of go through, do it again. And as long as you do it right the second time, you'll pass. And again, it doesn't happen often. Most people pass without any problem. But just if it does happen, key thing is to keep your cool. Don't go into panic mode. Any questions on that? And when in doubt, wash your hands. You won't get in trouble for, and by wash your hands, it's not like you have to get up and go to the bathroom. Just use the sanitizer. When in doubt, wash your hands. So if you're thinking like, oh shoot, I think I just rubbed my nose or I think I just touched my hair. If you're in doubt, wash your hands. You won't get in trouble for doing an extra hand washing. And if you want, you could even say to the proctor, like, oh, I touched my hair, so I'm going to wash my hands again. That kind of awareness will actually, they'll probably be impressed by that. So 3 times is kind of the minimum, but when in doubt, give your hands another wash. All right. And also be on the lookout for emails from the school because in the weeks leading up to the comps, all of the campuses generally offer practice sessions for the practicals where you can go in the room and you can do practice mock point locations and mock CNT and they watch you and give you feedback. And all the campuses usually offer some kind of practice sessions prior to the comp. So be on the lookout again for those announcements. Any questions on any of that? Oh, and lastly, I probably should have led with this. Lastly, if you haven't already registered for the exam, make sure you do that because the deadline is approaching. You have to be registered for the exam like within these first couple of weeks of the term. So signing up for the review class is not the same for signing up to actually take the comp. So if you haven't already submitted the petition, make sure that you don't delay on that. That like you go do it today or go do it tomorrow. All right. So does anybody who's here have any questions on anything? All right, well, that's a good place then. We've now done an overview, so you should have a pretty good idea of the big picture of everything to focus on. Now we'll start diving into some of the topics we can narrow down a little bit. So this will be a good time when we take our second break. We'll take an 8-minute break, and then we'll start with this handout that covers some pathophys. It covers autoimmune conditions, genetic, cancer, covers a bunch of pathophys stuff. So I need to take an 8-minute break, and then we'll pick up here. All right, everybody, let us finish up for the day. So first off, I know we don't have a lot of people here live, but of the people that are here live, does anybody have any questions on anything so far? Now that we've kind of done this broad overview and kind of told you, generally speaking, what are the things you have to start looking at before we do a deeper dive on some other topics? Any general questions on anything? All right. So now what we're going to do going forward, now through the rest of the review classes, we're going to now go into more like individual topics where we could really narrow it down a little bit. Like there's certain things like, for example, like I said, like point location, um, point categories. There's really nothing I could do to narrow it down. It's just like you got to know your point locations, all of them. You don't know which ones are going to get asked. You have to know your point categories, all of them. You don't really know which ones are going to be asked in your individual exam. But here, with some of these other topics that we're going to start with now, this is where I can narrow it down a little bit. We're not going to just say know your pathophysiology, right? We can narrow that down a little bit to what disorders are more likely to come up, what are the key signs and symptoms, the key details, if there's a key lab to know, a key pharmaceutical to know. That's where we could really narrow this down. So we're going to start on that with this handout here, which is a pathophysiology topic or topics. So we're going to have autoimmune conditions, some genetic disorders, and neoplastic conditions, meaning like tumors, cancers, and that kind of thing. So that's where we'll dive in now. So let's start with autoimmune. These, I would say, generally speaking, these questions are relatively straightforward as long as you kind of study the notes that I'm giving you and what I'm telling you to focus on, because most of these questions are not close. The way they put the questions on the second year comps, they tend to not be close answers. It tends not to be like, oh gosh, these are some vague signs and symptoms. It really could be this or it could be that. Not really. Not if you know what's here. That they always include the key details to make it very clear what the intended answer is. So if you know what's here, you should do just fine. So first off, you should be able to differentiate between osteoarthritis, sometimes referred to as DJD, which stands for degenerative joint disease, but more commonly today known as osteoarthritis. You should be able to differentiate what's the difference between osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. Remember the key difference. Osteoarthritis is just wear and tear. Rheumatoid arthritis is a systemic autoimmune disorder. So, in other words, anybody can develop osteoarthritis if they live long enough. This just wear and tear. It's due to injuries, it's due to overuse, improper body mechanics. And there's no real rules to it because it is just wear and tear. So it just kind of depends on the person's use of the joint over the years. So, I mean, there's no real rules. It could be in one finger, it could be in one knee, it could be both knees. Maybe one knee starts first, and 5 years later, you start to notice the other one. The bottom line is it's just wear and tear. So there's no real rules to it. It could affect any joint. It could be unilateral, could be bilateral. But even if it's bilateral, both joints could have started at different times. Now, the most common joints to be affected are the pips and the dips, the proximal interphalangeal joints and the distal interphalangeal joints, because we all use our fingers, right? We all type, play video games, use our phones. So these are the most common joints to be affected with osteoarthritis. But again, it could happen anywhere. If somebody plays baseball, they might develop it in their dominant shoulder from throwing, particularly if they're a pitcher or something. Rheumatoid arthritis, on the other hand, a much smaller subset of the population is going to develop rheumatoid arthritis. Off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact number of like what per 100,000, but they're not going to ask that anyway. This is a much smaller subset, 1% of the population, 1.5, whatever exactly the numbers are. And this is a systemic autoimmune disorder. So this is a condition where the immune system is attacking otherwise healthy tissue. It's attacking otherwise healthy tissue as if it were like a bacterial infection or something, as if those cells were bacterial cells rather than like healthy body cells. Autoimmune conditions in general, that's how they work. With rheumatoid arthritis, specifically, it's attacking synovial membranes. So, this is an autoimmune process where the immune system, for no good reason, is attacking synovial membranes. Because it is a systemic autoimmune disorder, this is always going to affect the person bilaterally. If it's affecting one wrist, it's going to affect the other. If it's affecting, one set of fingers, it's going to affect the other. This is always bilateral, symmetrical. Most commonly, it starts in the metacarpophalangeal joints, the MCPs, and then spreads to other joints. Most commonly, though, these are the first joints where the person notices it, because again, you're always using these joints, and then spreads to others. And then over time, this typically leads to permanent, without some kind of intervention, this leads to permanent joint deformities because scar tissue develops, the joints can calcify, so the joints can get stuck in really unusual positions. The hand could be stuck in almost like a claw-like position. So without some kind of intervention, this usually leads to pretty significant joint deformities. So again, the key thing here is wear and tear versus autoimmune, no real rules because it's just wear and tear versus bilateral symmetrical for rheumatoid arthritis. So those are the kind of key things you want to keep in mind. So you don't select one versus so you select the correct one if you have a comparison question. Then we have systemic lupus erythematosus, SLE for short, or often just called lupus. Technically, there's different versions of lupus. There are some versions of lupus that are less systemic. There's versions of lupus that just focus on the skin or just affect joints. But the most common one is the systemic lupus erythematosus. So most of the time when you hear about somebody talking about lupus, they're referring to SLE. And comps, I've never seen comps differentiate against versus the more mild types of lupus. Generally, on comps, if lupus comes up, this is the one. So, again, lupus is an autoimmune disorder where the immune system is attacking otherwise healthy tissue. In this case, it's a lot less focused than rheumatoid arthritis that primarily focuses on synovial membranes. In lupus, like it could attack the person's very DNA, which is in all cells. So lupus is known for affecting many organs, many tissues. It could include joints, but it's not just primarily focused on joints typically. It affects many organs, many tissues. And because of that, for that reason, it's sometimes difficult to determine just based on symptoms that a person has lupus because it can look like a lot of different things. It affects so many organ systems, it could look like a lot of different things. So there are a few hallmark features that for something like a comp exam, if the intended answer is lupus, there are some hallmark features that kind of highlight that lupus is the intended answer. So lupus, usually you see something about a butterfly rash. Remember, that's the rash that covers the bridge of the nose and over the cheekbones. And it kind of looks like the body and wings of a butterfly. It's usually a little bit of raised, red. It might be a little bit like burning or painful or itchy. Joint pain is common, but that doesn't really tell you for sure it's lupus because lots of things come with joint pain. They may get low-grade fevers during flare-ups. Again, that's not unique to lupus. I mean, anytime there's systemic inflammation, there might be a fever. So the butterfly rash is the big standout. But then it also tends to come with a lot of fatigue. There could be hair loss. Again, it is an immune process. So sometimes there's triggers. So people tend to have sensitivity to certain types of light, certain chemicals. So, it could be like certain shampoos might trigger it, for example. By it, I mean trigger a flare up. But usually, if they want you to pick lupus, either the other answers are so clearly some different thing that it's just there's no way the other answers could be justified. The only one that makes any sense is lupus, or they will give you the key standout butterfly rash. And they may tell you about the labs. So, lupus, the person is known for testing positive for what they call ANA antibodies, anti nuclear antibodies. So, typically, if they want you to pick lupus and they're trying to make it clear that lupus is the answer, butterfly rash, ANA antibodies are the two really big giveaways. Essentially, if you see those, go with the obvious answer. And actually, let me just say that as a little aside. For as a general rule with comps, do not overthink yourself into a corner. Most of the time, the intended answer, the correct answer, is the most straightforward answer. Don't approach every question like somehow it's a trick question. Like, oh, it says butterfly rash and ANA antibodies, but I feel like they're trying to trick me. I feel like it might be this other thing. Don't go down that road. Do your best to just always go with the most obvious answer based on what you know. Then we have systemic sclerosis, also known as scleroderma. It can overlap with lupus in the sense that it can affect multiple organs and tissues. But in this condition, it's known particularly for causing fibrosis, basically excess collagen deposits. You might refer to it as fibrosis or scar tissue, excess collagen. You might see it framed either way, but basically there's an accumulation of excess connective tissue as a result of the inflammation that's been triggered. And that can lead to basically thickening and tightening of whatever tissue is affected. And that could affect multiple organs, like it affect the GI, it cause things like difficulty swallowing or constipation because the GI tract doesn't work well if it's like all thick and tight. But again, standout sign symptom. Notice one of the names for this is scleroderma. Derm as in dermis. Almost always this disorder affects the skin. It could affect other organs and tissues, but it almost always affects the skin. And so there's this really hallmark feature. So if you see something about tight, shiny, tough, thick skin, that's pretty much like the highlight, the hallmark feature for this disorder. Tight, shiny skin, like to the point where they might have trouble moving it. Their face might look like they just got like Botox or something, like it doesn't move, but it's because the skin is so tight because of this disorder. Make sure you know both names, though. Make sure you know systemic sclerosis and that you also know it as scleroderma because it could be listed as either name on the exam. Then we have ankylosing spondylitis. This is similar to rheumatoid arthritis, but specifically it affects the sacroiliac joints and the spinal column. Rheumatoid arthritis tends to spare the spine. Rheumatoid arthritis tends to be a disorder affecting the extremities. But unfortunately, there's another disorder that kind of fills in that gap. So ankylosing spondylitis is an autoimmune disorder that behaves similarly to rheumatoid arthritis, but it focuses on the joints of the spine and the sacroiliac joints. And it leads to a really stiff, rigid, what they call bamboo spine, because the spine fuses. It looks almost like a straight rod. It loses its normal curvatures. The more technical term for the changes in curvature is they lose their lordotic curve. They develop hypolordosis. And they often develop like kind of a hunchback where the front of their body then gets hunched over, what they call hyperkyphosis. So sometimes these people are stuck kind of like looking at the ground. So again, you could see at a multiple choice exam like comps, where the way they ask the questions is pretty big picture. A lot of these disorders, as long as you know what's here, there's really no way to confuse them. There's nothing else to confuse ankylosing spondylitis with. Now, of course, in real life, there's all sorts of very complicated things that can happen and anything's possible and whatnot. But again, comps, it's a little more big picture. So on a multiple choice comp exam, as long as you basically know what's here, there really is nothing else to confuse these disorders with. Now, one laboratory finding that they might tell you for ankylosing spondylitis is there is a genetic finding that increases the risk of this condition. It's called the HLA-B27 gene. So if you get a question where they mention something about the person being positive for HLA-B27, that's definitely an indicator of ankylosing spondylitis. Now, one thing I just want to mention again that these notes obviously are very narrowed down, very to the point. Taking a class like pathophysiology and narrowing it down to a handful of bullets, don't further narrow it down. You really want to know what's there. Don't just try to remember one key word from each because, let's say you just remember, oh, ankylosing spondylitis, that's the one with the spine. Okay, move on. You could get a question that just simply says what condition is associated with the HLA-B27 gene. And if you just kind of go like ankylosing spondylitis, okay, that's the spine one, then you're not going to get a question like that correct. So what's here? Do your best to know it. Then we have multiple sclerosis. Again, an autoimmune disorder. In this case, though, it's an autoimmune process that attacks the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. Central nervous system remembers the brain and the spinal cord. So it attacks the myelin sheath around the axons in the brain and in the spinal cord. And of course, the axons in the brain and the spinal cord are conducting sensory signals into the brain from the body and motor signals, sending them down the spinal cord and out to tell the muscles what to do. So if you start damaging or leading to creating inflammation of those myelin sheaths, what's going to happen is those axons don't conduct effectively. They essentially short out. So motor signals, they don't reach their destination. And it starts to lead to things like weakness, paralysis, clumsiness, because they're not coordinating their muscles accurately. And so therefore, certain muscles are not working well with other ones. And so the person gets a little clumsy. They trip, they drop things. And of course, the signals go the other way, sensory, the input into the brain. So if those signals aren't conducting, there's going to be gaps in the person's sensory interpretation. So that can manifest in things like tingling, numbness, something along those lines, any kind of altered sensation. MS tends to start in the upper body in terms of the symptoms. So the way the symptoms present, it tends to start with upper body symptoms, like feeling weakness in the upper extremities or in the face or something like that, and then kind of tends to work its way down and out. And a key physical exam finding, something really simple that you can do in your office and exams, you'd love to ask us about these kinds of things because they know as acupuncturists, we don't have a lot of fancy equipment necessarily, but they want to know that we know how to screen for more serious disorders that might be outside of our scope. So Lermity sign, very simple sign. You ask the patient to flex their neck, like chin to chest, ask them to do that. And if they get an electric shock sensation running down their spine, that's a positive indication of MS, of multiple sclerosis. Now, that just means not necessarily 100% that they have multiple sclerosis, but it is a physical exam finding that suggests that it could be multiple sclerosis. So that's where you have to refer them out because, all right, this might be something a little beyond your scope. They should see a neurologist. So that would be the kind of thing where you want to screen for that kind of stuff. That's called Lermity sign. Then we have myasthenia gravis, autoimmune disorder. In this case, it's a little bit unique the way it works. There's these autoantibodies that are being produced, but they're not attacking and damaging tissues the way certain other autoimmune processes work. What they do, though, is they bind to and they accumulate in the neuromuscular junction. and they block the acetylcholine receptors. And you might recall acetylcholine stimulus is what stimulates a muscle to contract. The motor neuron releases acetylcholine. It binds to the receptors on the muscle, and that triggers the muscle to contract. So if those receptors are blocked, it's going to lead to muscle weakness. Typically, it doesn't cause full paralysis, but at least a muscle weakness. Essentially, the nervous system signal isn't getting through to the muscle effectively. And so, therefore, the muscles are weak. The person can't control the muscles effectively. And similar to MS, it tends to start in the upper body with things like ptosis of the eyelids, drooping eyelids, and then it tends to work its way down. Unlike MS, though, this doesn't affect sensation. This is just about motor control. This is not going to affect sensory input. And then lastly, in terms of autoimmune disorders, there's psoriasis. And basically with psoriasis for comps, they might describe the lesion. They might describe the plaques that a person gets. You just have to recognize that that description is describing psoriasis. So typically with psoriasis, the person gets these plaques, these thickened areas of skin. Usually it's dry, it's usually red. Sometimes it's like so dry that it looks almost white or almost silver. You know, if you have a really dry skin, you know that sometimes it looks kind of whitish. If you try to scrape it, it will bleed. They call that Auspitz's side. If you try to scrape the plaques off, it'll bleed. Sometimes it could be itchy. And there is something called psoriatic arthritis, where basically the same autoimmune process that's triggering this accumulation of thickened skin, it actually starts to affect the joints. And you want to know that there is such a thing as psoriatic arthritis because otherwise, let's say you get a case study where they describe this plaque and then they mention something about the person having severe joint pain. If you don't know that psoriatic arthritis is a thing, you might think to yourself, like, oh, shoot, I was thinking psoriasis, but now that they're telling me the person has all this joint pain, all right, I'm going to change my answer. I think they have osteoarthritis or something like that. Make sure that you know that there is such a thing called psoriatic arthritis, which is essentially psoriasis, that is where that autoimmune mechanism is also attacking joints. So don't let it throw you off, in other words. Does anybody have any questions about any of these conditions? Now, obviously, I have a lot of this stuff pre-typed and everything. You know, the reason I do that is because there's a lot to cover. So if I had to like pause to let everybody write things down and stuff like that, I would, we wouldn't be able to get through a lot of things. So a lot of this stuff is pre-typed, and it's up to you to know what works for you and what doesn't. But there is a benefit, when it comes to learning and getting things to really go into long-term memory. There is the benefit of using multiple senses and using more parts of the brain. So there's a benefit to like seeing it written, looking at pictures, hearing somebody talk about it, writing things down yourself. So writing additional notes, putting it in your own words, speaking it. So like, go to sessions with your friends where you quiz each other, explain your understanding. One thing I always used to do was pretend like I was explaining it to somebody else, where because that forces me to put it into my own words to understand it a little better. So when I was studying, I would pretend like I was describing it to somebody else. Like I have a patient that has such and such condition, and I'm explaining it to them. So try to use multiple parts of the brain. Yes, you could obviously just kind of go through and glimpse through the notes that are pre-typed and go, okay, yeah. But in terms of getting it in long-term memory, the more parts of the brain you use, the more it'll stick. Now, as far as some pharmacology, the way we'll address pharmacology, we're not really going to have a day where we like today's pharmacology day. Remember, there's only 6 questions. So what we'll generally do is as we're going over certain conditions, if there is pharmacology that applies, we'll talk about it at that time. So like here, we'll talk about the pharmacology that apply to some of these autoimmune disorders. And the good news with the pharmacology is that the pharmacology that comes up on comps mostly is big picture. Like what category of drugs do you use for certain conditions? You don't, there's really no questions about like chemical names or drug names or generic names. So there's a lot of stuff that might come up in your pharmacology classes that just doesn't really make the cut for comps. Because again, there's only 6 questions. So they're relatively big picture. So for the autoimmune disorders, essentially the person is given medications that suppress the immune system. They're mostly drugs that suppress inflammation, suppress, immune flare-ups. So there's the more mild, like over the counter, even though you can get prescription strength. There's kind of the more mild over the counter NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. This includes things like aspirin, ibuprofen, Advil, that kind of stuff. So basically, these just suppress inflammation. They all work by slightly different mechanisms, but I've never seen comps get into that. They suppress inflammation. The big thing here you want to know side effect is they increase the risk of upper GI bleeding, an ulcer, in other words, stomach ulcer, a duodenal ulcer. They increase the risk of that. So, they could ask, I mean, they could just ask you that straightforward, like which of the following is a side effect of NSAID use. Or, sometimes they could give you a little case study and a history of a person with rheumatoid arthritis that regularly takes Advil, something like that. Or they might just say regularly takes NSAIDs. Recently, they've been coughing up blood or they've been having a burning pain in their epigastric region. Which of the following do you think is most likely? And maybe the correct answer is something like upper GI bleeding as a result of repeated NSAID use. So you just want to make sure you understand the scenario, the possibility. And then, of course, there's actual steroids. Steroids themselves are anti inflammatory in nature, they suppress the inflammatory process. And those are a little more heavy duty, a little bit stronger effects. So the side effects of those, frequent infections, right? Because if you suppress the immune system, well, the good thing is it suppresses autoimmune processes, but the bad news is like you still have to fight infections. So finding that sweet spot isn't always easy. And so it could lead to frequent infections. We know steroids could also affect mood. So depression, anxiety, things like that can come up. And the types of steroids that are given medically for this purpose, these are what we call catabolic steroids. They're like cortisol. You might remember cortisol breaks down things like fat and muscle in order to raise blood sugar levels. But one of the things cortisol also does is suppress inflammation. So these are catabolic steroids. So they do lead to things like thinning of the skin, breakdown of bones. So it could lead to osteoporosis. And because it raises blood sugar levels, it could lead to things like insulin resistance. So it's always a challenge with these conditions. It's like trying to find the sweet spot between suppressing the things you want to suppress, but not creating all these other side effects. Sometimes people find that sweet spot in dosage and it works pretty well. Sometimes it's, you know, hard to find, hard to get that spot. So again, want to know some of these things. Now we have genetic disorders. Remember with genetic disorders, there's a few categories. There's what we call autosomal dominant disorders. Remember that with an autosomal dominant disorder, that means if you inherit the defective gene from either parent, then that person has the condition. In other words, with an autosomal dominant disorder, there's no carrier state. There's no way to just be a carrier. If a person inherits the defective gene, they have the disorder. Only one parent needs to give them a defective gene for an autosomal dominant disorder. It doesn't matter about the other gene. Now, there's lots of examples of these, but for COMPS purposes, you should know Huntington's disease, also known as Huntington's chorea, and Marfan syndrome. Huntington's, you may remember, is a disorder where the neurons in the brain prematurely degenerate. So they degenerate prematurely. So, in other words, the person is not, they're born with the genetic defect, but they're not born with the condition right away. Usually, this doesn't start, the signs and symptoms don't present until somewhere around their 40s. Because again, they're not born with a brain that right off the start doesn't work. They're born with a brain that has neurons that degenerate prematurely. So usually the signs and symptoms manifest somewhere around their 40s. And they start to, have issues with memory. They start to develop these involuntary, purposeless movements that they can't control. Their body will just kind of move in weird ways. And that's because the neurons are degenerating and they're having trouble controlling their body. And I mean, ultimately affects everything: memory, their ability to do day-to-day tasks. I mean, ultimately it results in, significant neurological degeneration. But it tends to start out with just simple things like memory lapses and, abnormal movements. That's where the term chorea comes in. Chorea as in choreography, the fact that it affects movements. Then you have Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome, very straightforward, usually a little less of a severe condition than Huntington's. This is a connective tissue defect. And it causes, basically it causes the connective tissue not to form properly. And the tissue has like a lack of density to it. It's not as well contained. It's not as strong. It's not as what's the word I'm looking for? It's not as well, I guess we'll just leave with the word I said. I think there was something else I was trying to come up with, but it has a lack of density and therefore a lack of strength to it. So the tissues tend to develop more length. They tend to be like longer and more flexible, more stretched out, is another way of looking at it. So these people tend to be very tall, very thin, really long wingspan, hyper flexible, bend their wrist and fingers all the way back, that kind of thing. But remember, the other side of the coin of hyper flexible is lack of stability. So their tissues tend to not be so stable. So they're prone to things like dislocations. They're prone to musculoskeletal deformities like scoliosis, chest wall deformities. How some people like their chest sticks out, or some people like their sternum, it's almost like an innie. They're more prone to things like that. They're prone to things like pneumothorax. And where it could potentially be life threatening is they're more prone to things like aneurysms, heart valve prolapses, because again, that's all connective tissue holding the blood vessels together, connective tissue, forming the heart valves and anchoring the heart valves. So they're prone to things like that. Marfan syndrome. Then we have autosomal recessive disorders. These are the ones where, in order to manifest the disease, the person has to inherit two defective genes, one from each parent. So with autosomal recessive conditions, it is possible to just be a carrier. It's possible to inherit one defective gene from one person, from one parent, but a healthy gene from the other. So the person's just a carrier. The other way to think about this is that with an autosomal recessive condition, the healthy gene could make up for the defective gene. So the person doesn't manifest the disorder. Whereas autosomal dominant disorders, you have to have two healthy genes. If one of them is defective, the healthy one doesn't make up for it. That's kind of the way to think about it. So with autosomal recessive disorders, the person only develops the condition if they inherit a defective gene from each of their parents. And under this umbrella, we have cystic fibrosis and albinism. I'll actually start with albinism because that one's really straightforward. This one's just lack of an enzyme to make melanin. So if they can't make melanin, essentially they don't have pigment in the body. So their skin is extremely pale, like almost paper white. There's no pigment in the iris of the eyes. Their hair is white. Mostly this is a cosmetic disorder. I mean, they have to be careful about things like sunburn and skin cancer and stuff like that. So they got to cover up. But generally speaking, this doesn't affect their health really in any other way. It's mostly a cosmetic issue. But a big one that you want to make sure that you know is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a defect in the chloride transport channels in epithelial cells. Sounds kind of like what? Like, what does that mean? Chloride transport channels? Like, I don't know. Like, what does transporting chloride mean? Like, what does that do? Bottom line is this affects the salt balance of bodily secretions. And salt, and of course, as you know, salt and water have an attraction to each other. So by affecting the salt balance in bodily secretions, it also affects the water content. And the main manifestation of this is that the body fluids, the bodily secretions, become extra thick, very sticky, very viscous, whatever word you prefer to use. They become too viscous, too thick. So that mostly manifests in the respiratory and digestive tracts. So the mucus in the respiratory tract, really thick, really sticky, clogs the respiratory tract. So it's hard to breathe. They get short of breath, they cough a lot, they get frequent infections because all that thick, viscous mucus traps bacteria and such. So a lot of breathing problems when somebody has cystic fibrosis. Also, their digestive enzymes, their bile, all that stuff, very thick, very sticky. So it doesn't mix with the food they're trying to digest very effectively. It doesn't mix in as effectively as it normally would. So it leads to impaired digestion and malabsorption. They're not getting in as many calories, as many proteins. So things like low body weight and then like distension in the GI and just compromised digestion, diarrhea, constipation. Those are all the many consequences of cystic fibrosis. And their sweat is excessively salty, very, very salty sweat. That's often the first thing that parents notice if they have a baby with cystic fibrosis is they kiss the baby and they notice the baby's like really salty. Like, what is that? Is that normal? That's usually the first thing that they notice. Any questions on any of that so far? Then we have what we call X-linked recessive disorders. What that means is the defective gene is on the X chromosome. This is more common in males because males, remember, only have one X chromosome. So if they inherit an X chromosome that has a defective gene, they're going to have the disorder because they don't have a second X chromosome with a gene to compensate. They just have the one defective gene for whatever that trait is. So X-linked recessive disorders tend to be more common in males for that reason. Females tend to be carriers more commonly because, they have the two X's. And muscular dystrophy and hemophilia fall under this umbrella. These two are pretty straightforward. I don't think anybody would confuse these with anything else. Muscular dystrophy is a disorder where the muscles start degenerating early in childhood, and eventually the person gets to the point where they're paralyzed, they can't move their body, their skeletal muscles just completely atrophied. Hemophilia, I think most people know, is a disorder where the person can't effectively clot the blood. Just the one thing about hemophilia to know, specifically the reason behind this, it's a deficiency in clotting factor 8. It's not a platelet deficiency. It's one of the 13 clotting factors that the person's deficient in. Clotting factor 8 is what's causing hemophilia most commonly. There's different versions of hemophilia, but the most common one is the clotting factor 8 deficiency. Then the last category here, other than the other, is aneuploidy. Aneuploidy is the term for when somebody has an abnormal number of chromosomes. So it's not about any one particular gene being defective or anything. It's that the person has an extra chromosome or they're missing a chromosome. So remember, generally humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. They get 23 from each parent for 46 total. Some cases, though, what happens is either in the sperm or in the oocyte, a chromosome gets copied. There's an extra copy that forms, or one doesn't copy properly. So most commonly, aneuploidy, the person has either 45 chromosomes or 47 chromosomes. As far as comps go, the two disorders that are most likely in this category to come up would be Turner syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome. And basically, these two are somewhat opposites of each other. In Turner syndrome, the person's born with one X chromosome. They both affect the sex chromosomes. In Turner syndrome, the person's born with one X chromosome, and then that's it. Like the other half of the pair is just missing. So they have 45 chromosomes total. And only one sex chromosome, which is an X. Because they have an X chromosome and they do not have a Y, that will code for what we associate generally as female genitalia. But with only one X chromosome, it's not going to form properly. It's not going to form completely. So it's going to, not function as well. So generally with Turner syndrome, they have, vaginal canal, vulva, the uterus, all that stuff, but it didn't form properly. So they have ovaries that are that are atrophied, hypogonadism. Because of that, low estrogen production. So that affects things like growth, and that could lead to like short, stocky build, webbed neck. Almost like the neck almost looks like it sits on the shoulders. It's going to affect ovulation because they won't form oocytes. Because again, these ovaries just don't function very well. So a lot of things like amenorrhea, without the estrogen, they're not going to develop secondary sex characteristics, at least not fully. So things like lack of breast development, stuff like that, those are the characteristics. So essentially, Turner syndrome, think female genitalia, but doesn't work fully. And Klinefelter is basically the opposite. Klinefelter, they have an XXY, they have an extra chromosome. So they have 47 chromosomes, 3 sex chromosomes. They have an XXY. So because of the presence of the Y, they do develop male genitalia. So they do generally have a penis, testicles, but similar to what we were saying with Turner syndrome, they don't form completely. They don't form fully. So it's generally, very small genitalia, atrophied testicles, lack of sperm production. So they're sterile, low testosterone production. So they don't develop the secondary sex characteristics. So they're known for things like lack of body hair, higher pitched voice, poor muscle tone, development of breast tissue, things like that. So again, I don't think with these there's anything else you would confuse them with, at least not in terms of what would come up on comps. The thing is just to make sure you don't flip them. Make sure you just remember which one is which, because it is easy to flip them. Like, oh God, I know these are the ones where it's like the sex chromosomes, but it's easy to flip which one is which. All right. And lastly, obviously it's that time people could take off if they have to, but just for the purpose of the recording, let's finish up the category. So lastly here, under the umbrella of other is spina bifida. Spina bifida, it's under the umbrella of other because it's not really a genetic disorder, but we just included it here because it is something that the baby is born with. So this is due to a deficiency in folic acid, or you could say folate during pregnancy. And essentially, pregnancy, folate or folic acid is really important for cell division. It plays a really important role in cell division. And you can imagine with an embryo, right, where we go from one cell to ultimately developing a full nervous system and organs and all that, there's a lot of cell division happening during this developmental period. So, one of the key problems that happens with lack of folate or lack of folic acid is the vertebral column doesn't fully close. And this occurs very early on in the development. So they call it the neural tube during the embryo stage, but it's ultimately what becomes the vertebral column. And it doesn't fully seal, it doesn't fully close. So then the baby might be born with an opening in the spinal column, a little opening where the spinal cord is exposed. That's what they call spina bifida, and it's generally linked to folic acid or folate, same thing, deficiency during the pregnancy. All right. So, any questions for the people that are here? Any questions on anything? Questions, general comments? All right, everybody. Well, we will pick up here next week. We'll start with this, and then I'm just noting that we'll start with this next week, and then continue on. Next week, we'll also go over extraordinary meridians. We'll go over a number of things next week. So, anyways, if you have questions, stick around. If not, we'll see you next week.